Under the new regime, if you process personal data, you will be subject to the sanctions regime, which includes the fines. And a lot of small to medium-sized enterprises think that the regime only applies to big companies that process lots of financial data like banks or medical records like health authorities. If you're a small to medium-sized enterprise, the chances are you will process personal data, whether it relates to your employees or to your customers. But it's going to be a very rare company indeed that doesn't process some form of personal data.
There's definitely a raised level of awareness. I think many are starting to look at new processes and technologies. I think there's still a long way to go in terms of where they are, and I still just think there's a large number that think their present investments are sufficient, which is not the fact.
Under the new regulations, they'd have to provide details of the number of individuals affected, the number of records affected, and the steps that they're likely to take or intending to take to mitigate the consequences. My experience has been that where the breaches have been significant, they've taken place over a prolonged period of time, in some cases as many as 200 to 300 days after the initial breach. It's only then discovered, and within a 72-hour period, it's very unlikely you'll have full understanding of the nature and consequence of the breach. And a recent example of that would be the TalkTalk data breach scenario, where their initial view was that the breach was much more significant than it actually turned out to be. There's been research done by a number of the consultancy firms looking at the length of time it takes organisations to discover breaches, and that timeline has actually been extending quite considerably over the last 12 to 18 months, and in some cases it's been several years before a significant breach has been discovered.
The level of fines and the impact in terms of the forced disclosure has made this now a board level issue rather than an IT issue. So in the past, the IT teams would be driving the strategy around cyber protection, data protection, with the boards fighting it because they're spending money. Now it's the boards protecting themselves and their jobs and their companies from potentially huge levels of fines, but also potentially huge brand damage as well associated with the forced disclosure.
If you're a major controller or processor of personal data, you will have to have a data protection officer. The number of records and the amount of processing that's required is going to be taken into account in determining whether or not you need to have a data protection officer, but it'll be around about 5,000 records or something like that, I believe.
Unfortunately, there's still a lot of false confidence around technologies that customers have invested in and processes they put in place for what I would term older threats, and not just external threats but also internal threats from users doing stupid things. And I think customers need to evaluate, is the technology they bought 5-10 years ago, is it still the right technology to protect them against the latest threat?
2 years seems a very long period of time, but in reality it will pass by very quickly, and in that period of time businesses really need to understand what data they have today and what data they may be using in the future. So they have to understand where the data came from, on what basis has it been provided, do they have the necessary consents or other legal basis in which they want to use it. They need to understand where it's stored, how it's stored, and more importantly, who uses it, what is it being used for, and is that covered by the new regime.